What's going on, people? King here. Welcome to the channel. And I actually want to start with a massive thank you to all the people who have engaged or subscribed to the channel. I'm now approaching, at the point of recording, 250 subscribers, and that's in a matter of less than a week. I've only posted 2 videos. One of them seems to be getting all the traction. The other one seems to be getting slightly ignored, but you know, hopefully that will balance itself out in time. But 250 subscribers, it's amazing. So I just want to thank everybody who's bothered to engage with the videos, who's posted comments, and obviously people who have subscribed. It's a massive deal. It's really motivating for me, and it shows that there is a hunger for this content, and it shows that there really is a place for this. So in today's video, I'm just going to be reacting to a video that I've seen that's quite popular. It's about ancient Egypt and their relation to Nubia, okay? And I did the air quotes are deliberate, and you'll see why in a moment. And I thought it would be quite interesting content. I do have more reconstructions on the way. If you're worried that I've been sidetracked by this, I certainly haven't. I just think it's good to explore kind of all areas. I'm very much a student of Sheikh Anta Diop, Theophila Benga, Dr. Ivan van Sertima, John Henrik Clark, all of the greats who have blazed the trail for people like me to then come after and create more research and do more investigation and share more knowledge. Without talking too much, I want to react to it. I think it's a good video, but I also think there's areas that definitely require further discussion and require us to do some further investigation before we just kind of accept what's being presented to us. It's very important that we as a people understand what's come before, understand the body of learning that has influenced them to have the perspective that they have. And they might not necessarily be a nefarious or negative person or someone who's trying to deliberately lie. A lot of the time they could have just come from a foundation of miseducation. So if we're able to see these things and actually understand what the truths are, we can challenge these things, and hopefully we can start to get more correct information out there. That's my little overview / synopsis. Let's get into it.
Egypt has always traditionally been given prominence as the height of ancient culture. Nubia is now coming into its own and is being understood to be of equal importance. It is different from ancient Egypt, but it is equally important and not just an adjunct to this Egyptian culture.
One of the things that I do want to tackle actually very early on before she goes on is actually defining what Nubia is, because the term Nubian has been used by historians, particularly Western historians, for a long time as essentially a dump for everything that's too overtly African, or anything that looks too in fact, let's not even use the word African, anything that looks too overtly black, you know, stereotypical Negroid, which is a defunct term, but anything that falls within that kind of sphere of racial paradigm gets dumped into the Nubian bin. For instance, you have people who are Libyan by definition in ancient Egypt being classified as Nubian. You have people who are Upper Egyptian, many who are Upper Egyptian being classified as Nubian. You get people who are Axumites, Meroe, Ta-Nehesi, Cushites, all classified as Nubian. So it's like a catch-all term, and let's call it what it is. In ancient Egypt and in this period of time, Nubia to Western historians just means black. They don't need any justification for classifying somebody as a Nubian. They simply just have to be confronted or presented with a black phenotype and they say, oh, it's a Nubian. The Armana family, for instance, have for a long time been classified. It's been, the wonder has been, do they carry Nubian blood because they look black? So it almost sets the scene, and this effort to separate Egypt from Nubia, and the reason is to separate Egypt from blackness, and it now gives us a convenient way to pull out anything that is too black and to put it in this Nubian dustbin. Ancient Egypt was made out of nomes. Nomes are essentially tribes So it's very similar to a tribal setup that you get in a nation like Nigeria, for instance. Ancient Egypt was made out of 40 nomes. I believe there was 18 in Lower Egypt and 22 in Upper Egypt. That number could have changed over time, but there was always roughly around 40 nomes. Each of these nomes had their own chief. So once again, like I said, very tribal. Some of these nomes, one of these nomes, for instance, in Upper Egypt is Tarseti, and that's in Upper Egypt. Tarseti has been classified many times as Nubian. They see the pictures of these men with the bows, okay, the Magi, as they're called, and these Magi are classified as Nubian. But the Magi aren't Nubian, they're Upper Egyptians. By definition, they're from the land of Tarseti. But this is where the deception comes in. So I know I've gone on for a little bit, but you have to be really careful with what is branded Nubian and why it's being branded Nubian, and is there an actual justification for calling it Nubian. Let me carry on.
What archaeologists do when they pull material from the ground or when they translate texts, they bring their own cultural baggage to that interpretation and the baggage of the times that they live in. And so it's imperative that we go back and continually reassess the things that we take as facts.
Egyptology is baggage. Let's just get that out and let's make that straight. The fact that there's a study called Egyptology, you have to understand that that is very divisive in itself. There's no other area on earth that has been given its own portion of history. If you study ancient Greece, you're a historian. If you study ancient Rome, you're a historian. If you study medieval Britain, you're a historian. If you study ancient Egypt, you have to be an Egyptologist. So that's very powerful. What they've done there is they've created a class, and they've created effectively a gate system for anybody who wants to come along and study in ancient Egypt. And they did this so they could control the messaging, they could control the information, and they could control the dialogue. If you go and you argue, well, the ancient Egyptians, I believe all the ancient Egyptians were black African. Oh, you're a pseudo-Egyptologist. You're not a proper Egyptologist. They've now got a wrong and right. It's very powerful because you can't do this in any other area of history. You can come in and make up whatever clag chop you want about ancient Rome, but when it comes to ancient Egypt, you have this sphere of Egyptology that essentially controls and protects all of the information that passes inside and outside of it. So it's really important to understand when Egyptology was established, it came in just after the French Revolution. You had a Europe that was rife with conquering, and obviously it's coming at the tail end of the slave trade and just prior to the total annexation and colonization of Africa. This is the very height of racism, and it was very important that they controlled the information that was coming out of ancient Egypt, because essentially they're figuring out in a very short expanse of time after the deciphering of the Rosetta Stone that ancient Egypt is the grandfather. Ancient Egypt is the foundation nation for all of civilization. Yeah, all of civilization, global civilization seems to center around Africa. And this is presenting a huge challenge to the intelligentsia, who are obviously just turning the wheels of purporting this Western model of Western civilization, and Greece being the place of first thought. Before Greece, man didn't used to think, we just used to rub sticks together and grunt. But then ancient Greece came along, and along with it came thought, and then they find ancient Egypt and they realize actually we're completely wrong. Everything starts here. So they revised the models. So I think what she said there is really quite powerful. When historians, or Egyptologists, I should say, are now picking up Egyptology, they have to understand they are picking up or inheriting a broken system. Those early books on Egyptology are based on racism, particularly the ones done by the British. Petrie comes to mind. Petrie was the inventor of the dynastic race theory, because they were confronted with the fact that they knew ancient Egypt's population was essentially black. They're very aware of that. There's no secret here. They know that the ancient Egyptians were largely black. So they said, well, the ruling class came from Mesopotamia. They came from outside Egypt, and they brought their civilization into Egypt. This is the dynastic race theory. So it's a nice, convenient way to explain away the basically you had a very simple, dumb black population, and then along came the Mesopotamians, the Caucasoids, as they like to call them, even though that's debatable, but I'm not going to go to that right now. Along came the Mesopotamians, and they civilized this group of savage blacks, and brought civilization over to them. This is classic Eurocentrism. I've gone around in a bit of a circle, but I agree with what she just said there. It's really important that historians assess the basis and assess the foundation of the information that they're basing their conclusions on, and don't just build on faulty foundations.
Many of the early archaeologists came to the study of ancient Egypt and ancient Nubia from the perspective of Semitic languages or the study of the Hebrew Bible, and it was very important to them to bring Egypt specifically into the sphere of biblical studies. So
I'm just going to pause it there. Another really good point she raised there is this whole idea of biblical studies, or the Judeo-Christian worldview, which was very pervasive. I mentioned Petrie earlier, and I spoke about the fact that he was responsible for the dynastic race theory. Another thing that he was responsible for was the pervasive notion that there was slavery in Egypt, because that needed to be supported from what was written in the Bible about the Jews being enslaved. And Petrie was very much a proponent of progressing this Judeo-Christian worldview and making the nation of Egypt, which was called Mizraim in the Bible, making this nation fall into the biblical worldview as opposed to approaching anthropology from an objective standpoint.
And so they had to carve Egypt away from Africa to bring it into that sphere. And the way that they did that was they used race. So these early archaeologists effectively made ancient Egypt white, in the sense that they made it part of a dominant Western culture, and ancient Nubia was separated from that. It was black. And this was how they took Egypt out of Africa and put it into this Semitic sphere, this biblical sphere.
What's really interesting about this point that she's raised here is that if you look at the quote-unquote Nubian pharaohs, the ones of the 25th dynasty, who obviously everyone agrees there were Nubian pharaohs, they don't look any different than the normal Egyptian pharaohs. They have exactly the same facial features. You'll be hard pressed to tell Pharaoh Taharqa apart from Pharaoh Sahure or Amenhotep III. They all have very, very similar, almost identical facial features. The difference is we get to see Pharaoh Taharqa's facial features because he's a Nubian, so they didn't have to destroy his nose because it was accepted that he was black, unlike the Egyptian ones, where their nose had to be destroyed because no one could know that they resembled Africans. And what was really interesting about what she said about making Egypt white is that it goes back to the point I raised earlier about this Western model that was being championed by these historians. Martin Bernal mentioned that there was a two-pronged approach to the way that they were going to handle Egypt. And this isn't even the French. The French, who kind of were the first into Egypt, Count Volney and Champollion, who were some of the first archaeologists to begin talking about Egypt, were very open about the fact that Egypt was an African and a black civilization. There was just too much evidence in front of them. There would have been no benefit in denying it. So they were quite open about it. And actually Count Volney was almost repentant about the way Europeans were treating Africans as a result of what he discovered in ancient Egypt. Now, the British, when they entered into Egyptology, were much more unforgiving. And actually, it's almost poetic, because it's exactly what the British are like today. The British are very, very much unrelenting racists, and they're quite open about it, and they're very proud. So when they approached Egyptology, they were adamant that they were going to do two things. The first thing is they were going to, as she mentioned there, separate Egypt as much as possible from the African continent. Make it seem like it's a part of the Mediterranean, not a part of the African continent, irrespective of their culture, irrespective of their look. In every way, they're going to undermine anything that connects Egypt to Africa and try to connect it to the Mediterranean. The second thing they do is actually they were going to undermine ancient Egypt whilst doing this. And you see this happening already. So you see this with the reconstruction of Tut, when they're giving him all of these disabilities, and they're talking about how inbred he was and how gross these Egyptians were. This isn't just objective science. This is part of a strategy that Egyptology is based on. Egyptology is based on the undermining and the embarrassing of ancient Egypt, and also claiming it whilst also separating from Africa, because they don't want ancient Egypt at any stage, because of its association with Africa, to overrule the idea of Greek being the center of thought and the ground zero for mankind's civilization, or for modern civilization. So they know, as much as they want to make Egypt as part of the Western model, its location is always going to be troublesome to really advancing this idea. So you have to be aware that there's a two-pronged attack here. They're not just going to claim Egypt and separate it from Africa and make it Mediterranean, but they're also, with each discovery, going to undermine Egypt more and more. They undermine their technology, they undermine their advancements, they undermine everything about what the ancient Egyptians achieved. And this is very much why we have to reject whatever essentially they, and when I say they, I'm talking about Eurocentric Egyptologists, present to us.
And it's only in recent decades, the last 3-4 decades, that Egyptology has really moved away from that. And scholars who are studying Nubia are really given the chance to give a voice to this Nubian material that it wasn't given much of a chance to have in the past. Someone asks me, what was the ancient Egyptians' view of X? I immediately think of a two-pronged view, because the ancient Egyptians had an official view of many things, and this is the view that would be put up on the walls of temples and on the walls of the tombs of the elites. That was an official, let's say, state-sanctioned view. That bore little to no resemblance to what people actually may have thought. It was
okay. I'm going to pause here, because I know where she's going with this, and this is why, in some ways, it would have been good for her to take her own advice, because this is one of the things that historians do. They really try to fabricate this ongoing enmity and war that was taking place between Egypt and Nubia. They really do overemphasize its significance. There are literally a handful of steles, and these aren't on public display. Most of these are actually inside tombs. So I'm not going to go into that, but there are actually a handful of displays that show ancient Egypt at war with Nubia. One of them that people refer to over and over again is King Senusret II, I think it was, or Pharaoh Senusret II, talks about crushing the Nubians, and by the way, he didn't use the term Nubian. It would have been a specific place south of Egypt. It could be any one of several hundred African states, but he just needs to mention one, and we just need to see pictures of people that are black, and bingo, ancient Egypt is at war with the Nubians. Do you see how cleverly this is done? If it was the other way around, and you'll see a pharaoh holding an Assyrian by the hair, it'll be made very clear this is an Assyrian. He won't say, he's at war with all of Asia and Egyptians therefore hated all Asians. But this is the way they spin history. So this is where you have to be careful, because now you're using that term Nubian, and she's doing it probably without any cognition that that's actually what she's doing, but she's using Nubian to refer to all of Black Africa. There's been no attempt to specify the individual nations that are mentioned at certain points, what part of Nubia was being mentioned when they showed a war, and perhaps when they were at a war with this one Nubian nation, there were 50 Nubian nations that we're at peace with. But you're never going to be given this perspective, because you're always presented with this monolithic idea. Egypt, Black Africa equals Nubia. You know, let's forget about the fact that Egypt, like I said, had 40 nomes. And let's forget about the fact that some of these nomes would even go into situations of civil war. They would be warring between nomes within Egypt. All of that, let's just forget that. Forget about the different ethnicities, and let's just, whenever we see an Egyptian fighting or having a disagreement with people that are black, or seemingly subduing or undermining or subjugating people of a black phenotype, we just classify that as a time of war between Egypt and Nubia. Do you see how you have to be careful with the language that's being used here?
So when you look at Nubia as depicted on the walls of temples in Egypt, you will see Nubians being crushed under the chariot wheels of the king. You will see Nubians being dragged back to Egypt enslaved. What we see on the ground in terms of archaeological evidence.
Just have to pause it there. Is there again, you know, Western historians cannot help but bring up slavery whenever they talk about anything black. I'm not sure if there's any enslavement in Egypt. I don't think there is any. There's no real evidence. There's one stele that people always point to. It's being coloured now. It wasn't coloured originally, so it's just wall art that doesn't have any colour. But it's clearly Nubians sitting down, and then maybe some Egyptian scribes standing over them. And you know they're scribes because they have the scribes' headdress. And they have sticks in their hands. And they're like, this is an example of slavery. But the people sitting down on the floor are clearly students. There's a man who's holding a book or a papyrus of sorts in his hand. And they're sitting down. There's no chains. They're students who are being taught, or maybe a village or an ethnicity, a specific group. They look like the Nuba people of Sudan, I want to say, but I could be wrong. The ancient Egyptians were quite precise and quite accurate in the way they drew phenotypes. So they would try to show and make it clear which part of Africa they were referring to in the art. So when she talks about, you know, the official party line was, we crushed the Nubians, that's, once again, she's taken reference from a body of Egyptology that is essentially broken. Because if you actually look at the evidence, there's no evidence of enslavement, first of all, of Nubians. That's baloney. But secondly, there's very little evidence even of war. I'm not saying it doesn't occur. There are occasions when you can literally see, you know, a specific set of Africans that Egypt is going to war against, and they are being crushed under the feet of chariots. But there are just as many of them showing them bringing gifts and showing them partaking in diplomacy with one another. You know, Egypt, apart from a few specific periods of expansion, was a very peaceful nation that wasn't constantly steeped in war like most Western nations in modern history. Egypt was just, the pharaohs were just as brutal about their depictions of Egypt versus other Asiatics and Indo-European races. They're quite clear. So the brutality shown by the pharaohs towards essentially all outsiders at some point in time has been depicted. It just seems to be given a disproportionate amount of attention when it comes to them being Nubian. And once again, Nubian, like I said, is a catch-all term for everything that's Black African.
Is quite different. We see people who had Nubian names, people who were using Nubian material culture, living within Egypt, working in Egypt, marrying people with Egyptian names. So something quite different from the
Once again, this is where you have to be careful with the language. She's talking about Nubian names and Egyptian names. I've already mentioned the fact that there are 40 nomes, and within the nomes of Egypt, the naming conventions will be very different. They're separate ethnicities. They are separate cultures, very, very different. Would names coming from Tarseti have been classified as Nubian names? If you look at the naming convention of the Old Kingdom pharaohs to the New Kingdom pharaohs, the naming conventions are very different. So once again, you just have to be careful with the language that's being used here. What does she classify as a Nubian name? Is she talking about names in Aksum or modern day Ethiopia, or names from Sudan, or names from Punt, modern day Somalia, or names from Libya? What names is she talking about when she's talking about Nubian names being used?
Very intense militaristic scenes that you see in temples. When George Reisner excavated Kerma, he found the statue, a large, beautiful statue of Senui, and also a statue partially destroyed of Jaffa Happy, her husband. It was a very large tomb, and with size in Egypt and in Nubia, we tend to assume ruler or someone very important, which usually translates to ruler. We now understand, yes, this was a ruler's tomb. It is a completely different time period than Jaffa Happy and Senui lived in. Much later, we understand it to be a local ruler, so it was a Kerman official who, for reasons we can guess at, brought or had these two statues brought to Kerma and put in his tomb. It could have been an appropriation of Egyptian culture in general, just to show that, yes, I can own these things that are Egyptian wonderful works of art.
See, at this point, this is when it all falls apart for me. This story is such a it's such a non-starter. It's so insignificant if we're going to talk about Nubian history, to talk about some random official taking a statue and placing it within his tomb because he wants to show that he can own Egyptian art, as though that's the height of the height of Nubian advancement, was to steal a couple of statues from Egypt. This is to be honest with you, this is almost cynical. It's a really pathetic story, and I hate to be so brutal about it, because, you know, if we've got to talk about, you know, Nubian works of art, we could talk about the pyramids, we could talk about Lake Nasser and the flooding of Nubian antiquities. We could also talk about Abu Simbel, which survived the flooding of the Nubian plains, and the fact that that entire temple system was in Nubia. It was a part of Nubia. It wasn't a part of ancient Egypt. These are Nubian achievements, and there are several. And I'd imagine there are more Nubian achievements probably than ancient Egyptian, if they weren't sitting under Lake Nasser, and one of the biggest historical destructions that we have in recent times. So when she's talking about this tale of an official in Kerma stealing a couple statues, I think this, once again, this is Western archaeology at its finest. This is just slyly undermining. People who aren't aware of Nubian history, they're going to think that this is the height of Nubian advancement, you know, because they had the audacity to go into Egypt and steal a statue. And also, it's of note that they've shown this statue from a profile view, and this is probably one of the most, you might be able to pass this as a Arab. This is quite rare in ancient Egypt. Most of the time they just look African, but because this one could be passed as a Mediterranean, they probably selected this one quite deliberately. She's doing now the very thing that, she said that she was aware of. She's kind of like trying to create this separation between who the Nubians are and who the Egyptians are. Oh, he was able to own this beautiful statue of a white woman. She might as well have just said that. I hope that's not what she meant, but you know, me with my cynical mind, that's how I've interpreted it. I think I'll leave it there. That's pretty much the end of the video now at this stage anyway. I hope you enjoyed that. It's a reaction video, and I thought it would be quite interesting because, you know, it's a popular video, and I think it's important for us to stand our ground when we talk about ancient Egypt and we talk about ancient African civilizations and Nile Valley civilizations. We should essentially know where we stand and know enough so that we're not being hoodwinked when they present us with questionable information. So yeah, that's the end of the video. If you've enjoyed it, please do hit the like button. If you haven't subscribed, please do subscribe. I did mention that I've got some more reconstructions coming literally in the offing. So, you know, get subscribed, hit the like button, and if you want to support me, you can do so on Patreon. Thank you for tuning in. I'm King, and I'm out.